Abraham Maslow challenged the traditional scientific and psychotherapy community in 1960 in his book Religion, Values, and Peak Experience, where he argued that peak experience, and these are moments of profound spiritual experiences, were deeply meaningful to the people who had them, and that we should be studying them. And in many cases, they were so meaningful that it alleviated these people's depression, their sense of meaninglessness and despair that they had. But this was during a time when the scientific community was heavily influenced by logical positivism, and the psychotherapy practice was still influenced by Freud's work. This is episode 34. I hope you're enjoying the podcast, and if you are, please help me get this in front of like-minded people by sharing it with your friends, leaving a 5-star review on Spotify or on Apple, or subscribing it with the bell if you're on YouTube, so that you'll know when all of the new episodes come out. And you can also head over to my Patreon and Substack to support this work. Without further ado, let's get into it. The very beginning, the intrinsic core, the essence, the universal nucleus of every known high religion has been the private, lonely, personal illumination, revelation, or ecstasy of some acutely sensitive prophet or seer. The high religion call themselves revealed religions, and each of them tend to rest its validity, its function, and its right to exist on the codification and the communication of the original mystic experience or revelation from the lonely prophet to the mass of human beings in general. But it has recently begun to appear that these revelations or mystical illuminations can be subsumed under the head of the peak experiences or ecstasies or transcendent experiences, which are now being eagerly investigated by many psychologists. That is to say, it is very likely, indeed almost certain, that these older reports, phrased in terms of supernatural revelations, were in fact perfectly natural human peak experiences of the kind that can easily be examined today, which, however, were phrased in terms of whatever conceptual, cultural, and linguistic framework the particular seer had available in his time. In a word, we can study today what happened in the past and was then explainable in supernatural terms only. By doing so, we are enabled to examine religion in all its facets and in all its meaning in a way that makes it a part of science rather than something outside and exclusive of it. Also, this kind of study leads us to another very plausible hypothesis. To the extent that all mystical and peak experiences are the same in their essence and have always been the same, all religions are the same in their essence and always have been the same. They should, therefore, come to agree in principle on teaching that which is common to all of them, i.e., whatever it is that peak experiences teach us in common, whatever is different about these illuminations can fairly be taken to be localism, both in time and space, and are therefore peripheral, expendable, and not essential. This something common, this something which is left over after we peel away all the localism, all the accidents of particular languages or particular philosophies, all the ethnocentric phrasings, all those elements which are not common, we may call the core religious experience or the transcendent experience. To understand this better, we must differentiate the prophet in general from the organizer or the legalist in general as abstracted types. I admit that the use of pure extreme types which do not really exist can come close to the edge of caricature. Nevertheless, I think it will help all of us in thinking through the problems we are here concerned with. The characteristic prophet is a lonely man who has discovered his truth about the world, the cosmos, ethics, God, and his own identity from within, from his own personal experience, from what he would consider to be a revelation. Usually, perhaps always, the prophets of the high religions have had these experiences when they were alone. Characteristically, the abstract type of the legalist ecclesiastic is the conserving organization man, an officer, an arm of the organization, who is loyal to the structure of the organization, which has been built up on the basis of the prophet's original revelation, in order to make the revelation available to the masses. From everything we know about organizations, we may very well expect that people will become loyal to it, as well as to the original prophet and to his vision, or at least they will become loyal to the organization's version of the prophet's vision. I may go so far as to say that characteristically, and I mean not only the religious organization, but also parallel organizations like the Communist Party or like revolutionary groups, these organizations can be seen as a kind of punch card or IBM version of an original revelation or mystical experience or peak experience to make it suitable for groups' use and the administrative convenience. This was an excerpt from Abraham Maslow's Religion, Values, and Peak Experiences. Abraham Maslow, born 1908, died 1970, known for creating the famous Maslow hierarchy of needs. The model outlines the stages of human psychological development from low to highest potential fulfillment, or otherwise known as self-actualizing. And his ideas have impacted our modern understanding of human motivation and personality development. Now, in this book that we're looking at today, Maslow is exploring the nature of religious experience, as we just read in that excerpt. What sometimes is called mystical, transcendental experience. Because he thinks that having this spiritual moment of ecstasy and unity provided a sense of meaning and fulfillment in an otherwise valueless society, we should be studying this. We shouldn't be ignoring it and putting it out as something that is only reserved for a certain type of people or something not scientific, according to Maslow. And this is the main reason we're looking at this book. It's because what Maslow goes on to say in the book, the description he gives of these states of consciousness, in that the experiencer becomes fully aware of the present moment, fully engaged in the moment, experiences the eternality and the fluidity of a single instance, and they develop a sense of fulfillment, that everything that's happening to them is meaningful. It's what is supposed to happen to them. Is not too different from what we've looked at in Thich Nhat Hanh, or in Marcus Aurelius, or in Lao Tzu, or in Krishnamurti, or in Henry Newman, to mention some of the minds that we've already looked at. These guys, right, they emphasize the power of being fully present in the moment, in the here and now. How in this simple practice of being fully engaged, that is when you become fully human. And peak experience that Maslow is describing here is in one sense the same thing, but he's using quantitative language that can be studied using his methods. So let's go a bit further into what peak experience is. Peak experience, as I mentioned, refers to these extraordinary moments in your life that you experience, and that which creates a sense of euphoria, of wonder, of profound meaning. And in these moments, you become more alive, or at least you feel more alive. You are more engaged in the moment. You are able to connect with the world around you. You have a deep sense of fulfillment, of purpose, of peace. And Maslow believed that these peak experiences was when people became closest to their most authentic self. It was that moment where they had the clearest idea of who they were. They could overcome any sense of separation between their ego and their true self. And also, these individuals felt a deep sense of connection to the cosmos, to God. The sense of egolessness happened to them. And Maslow notes in the book that these experiences can be extremely transformative. And they're not limited to those who have reached his top of his pyramid and have attained self-actualization. Maslow says, no, anybody can have peak experience. And he says these moments of peak experiences can happen anytime, any activity. It could be if you're doing creative endeavor, or if you're having an intimate moment with a loved one, or you're doing an everyday task, but you're somehow fully engaged in that task. You can develop a sense of profound significance in that moment. And for Maslow, peak experience is something that the mystics of all the religions have been trying to explain to people using their own specific local language and own specific cultural concepts to pass forth this understanding of mystical union with the cosmos, with God, with everything around them. And this is also part of the reason why Maslow is slightly skeptical of organized religion as we understand it, because he sees organized religion as actually preventing people from experiencing peak experiences versus allowing it to happen. But the one thing to note is the climate in which Maslow is writing. Maslow is writing around the time when logical positivism is heavily influential in the scientific community. So what is logical positivism? In the 1920s and in the 30s, scientists and philosophers took David Hume's fork to purify knowledge. Hume's fork states that reliable knowledge comes from one, ideas that are derived from material sensation of the world, and two, ideas are logically necessary. Think in this case of math. What this does is that it obviously leaves out a huge chunk of human experience and knowledge. Things like literature, law, philosophy, theology, religion, spirituality as a whole, and the list can go on. Anything that doesn't fit between Hume's fork gets scrapped. So these positivists took Hume's fork and said, you know what, let's go a bit further. And then they came up with the verification principle. And the verification principle says that anything that cannot be verified empirically is meaningless and false. Now you can see how this would make Maslow's work challenging and how his work itself would challenge the community at large. Because what Maslow is saying here is he's not only positing that non-empirical things like peak experiences are true, but that they are deeply meaningful in a way that's saying something like grass is green is not. There's something happening with peak experience, with these profound spiritual experiences that people are having. And this obviously goes completely at odds with the verification principle. The interesting thing, and the side note here, is the reason why logical positivism as a whole has crumbled and you don't really hear about it is because the verification principle itself is not verifiable by the principle. It can't fulfill its own criteria, meaning that the verification principle is self-referentially incoherent. You can't take the verification principle and put it under a microscope and study it. It's not logically necessary, and it's also not something that we can derive from sensation. You can't go out in the world and find the verification principle sitting under a tree. Neither is there any way in which you can derive the verification principle by logical necessity. And so then it becomes incoherent and self-referentially incoherent. But at the time of Maslow's writing, these guys were the end-all and be-all. They were the guys to be. And so his work is very challenging, and Maslow had a lot of pushback on his work. One thing that Maslow noticed was, he mentions this in the book, that there was a change taking place within the science and within the religion. And due to the rise of cross-scholarship across the world and access to faster communication back then, remember he's writing this in the 1960s, the changes that he's speaking of are the openness in the scientific community around phenomenons like mystical experience. This is in the 60s, right? The whole hippie movement is happening. Previously, the scientific community was wholly caught up in what I just described as the logical positive movements, and they're starting to move away, but it's still heavily influenced by it. And Maslow's starting to notice this, right? He's starting to see this ideology crumble. Maslow views science and religion as needing each other, as two sides of the same coin. He tells a story from Philip Wiley's book, The Disappearance, when men and women get separated and they start living in isolated worlds without any contact. And what ends up happening is both of these parties become corrupted and pathologized. And so Maslow says, look, this is what's happening to our science and to our religion. We need to bring these two back together, and his book is that. The question then is, how did this happen? And Maslow writes, one could say that the 19th century atheist had burnt down the house instead of remodeling it. He had thrown out the religious questions with the religious answers because he had to reject the religious answers. But what the more sophisticated scientist is now in the process of learning is that though he must disagree with most of the answers to the religious questions, it is increasingly clear that the religious questions themselves are rooted deep in human nature, that they can be studied, described, examined in a scientific way. The questions themselves were and are perfectly acceptable and perfectly legitimate. So what exactly is happening when somebody has a peak experience according to Maslow? What's happening is that they are experiencing what Maslow calls B-Cognition, or being cognition. And it's this concept that describes a particular state of the mind when somebody's having peak experience. Right? In this state of consciousness, everything becomes holistic. The person becomes unselfish. They have a deep understanding of love. It makes it possible for them to perceive and to enjoy others as an end in themselves and not as a means to an end. They have a deep connection with the cosmos, with everybody around them. There's a sense of what today is known as an ego death. The person perceiving the world in a B-Cognition has this unified and integrated way. Right? It involves this deep appreciation for the intrinsic value of an object or an experience without any desire to use it for their own need. And like I said, they have this sense of like oneness with the universe and a connection to everything. And finally, they become fully aware of the present moment and are fully immersed in the experience of this life, often leading to a feeling of awe, of wonder, of transcendence. And in this, everything starts to find unity and harmony somehow. If you've read any mystical works, any religious tradition, you can start to pick out the similarities that Maslow is here describing with B-Cognition. And for Maslow, as I mentioned, what the mystics of these different religions, different primitive religious practices and rites that have been going on for centuries, everybody is experiencing the same thing, but in a different way. And they're expressing it in their particular local manner, local concepts, and local language. And in these moments of peak experiences, the individual, the person having it, often sheds away any sense of meaninglessness, any sense of despair. Everything kind of melts away, and they start to feel that everything is meaningful and that they're able to see the beauty in the mundane things. And this is what Maslow is trying to get at. And Maslow is trying to stress that this experience, this peak experience, is the most important experience that a human being can have, because it is what makes the human being the most human. And right at the end of the book, Maslow talks about B values or being values as descriptions of perception in peak experiences. And I quote, "The described characteristics of being are also the values of being. These being values or B values are perceived as ultimate and as further unanalyzable, and yet they can each be defined in terms of each and all of the others. They are parallel also by the characteristics of selfhood, identity, in peak experiences, the characteristics of ideal art, the characteristics of ideal mathematical demonstrations, of ideal experiments and theories, of ideal science and knowledge, the far goals of all ideals, uncovering Taoistic non-interfering psychotherapies, the far goals of the ideal humanistic education, the far goals and expressions of some kind of religion, the characteristics of the ideally good environment and of the ideally good society. The following may be seen either as a list of the described attributes of reality when perceived in peak experiences, or as a list of the irreducible intrinsic value of this reality. 1. Truth, honesty, reality, nakedness, simplicity, richness, essentially, oughtness, beauty, pure, clean, and unadulterated completeness. 2. Goodness, righteousness, desirability, oughtness, justice, benevolence, honesty. 3. Beauty, rightness, form, aliveness, simplicity, richness, wholeness, perfection, completion, uniqueness, honesty, wholeness, unity, integration, tendency to oneness, interconnectedness, simplicity, organization, structure, order, not dissociated, synergy. 4. Dichotomy, transcendence, acceptance, resolution, integration or transcendence of dichotomies, polarities, opposites, contradictions. 5. Aliveness, process, not deadness, dynamic, eternal, flowing, self-perpetuating, spontaneity, self-moving, energy, self-forming, self-regulation, full functioning, changing and yet remaining the same. And 6. uniqueness, idiosyncrasy, individuality, singularity, non-comparability, its defining characteristics, novelty, quail, suchness, nothing else like it. 7. Perfection, nothing superfluous, nothing lacking, everything in its right place, unimprovable, just right, just soness, suitability, justice, completeness, nothing beyond oughtness. And then he goes on to list 7 more. What he's getting at with these B values is that these values are what human beings strive for through religion, through the science, through philosophy, through spirituality. But it is those who experience peak experience who are able to have this sense of B values. So he writes, the human yearning for peace, stability, for unity, for some kind of certainty, all continue to exist and to seek fulfillment even after the religious establishments have failed to do the job. So these people who have these mystical experiences are the ones who end up coming out of it saying, it is the most meaningful thing that I've experienced and it has transformed the way I view the world. It's pulled me out of the depression. It's pulled me out of this meaninglessness, nihilistic framework that I was functioning in. What's interesting is that in the opening chapter of this book, in a footnote, he writes that religious words like sacred, divine, holy, sin, prayer, reverence, piety were all used to refer to God or some spiritual experience to believers, are what his patients, some of whom or many of whom were non-theist, and they were using these words like sacred, divine, holy, sin, reverence. And so he writes, now what I want to say is that each and all of these words and many other religious words have been reported to me by non-theistic people in their effort to describe particular subjective happenings in the natural world. He puzzles over why this is the case, but doesn't really give an explanation of why it is that they're using these words. And so he says, look, I'm just going to use these words because it seems to capture the experience the best according to these non-theistic patients who are having mystical experiences. Maslow also makes this very interesting point about how artists and humanistic scholars were supposed to be the one who inspired us and the society at large to have a sense of awe and grandeur and holiness through their work, right? The artist is supposed to inspire the viewer through his artwork a sense of awe, a sense of grandeur, a sense of divinity, a sense of reverence. And further, they were the ones who historically portrayed the good, the beautiful, and the true. But in our modern day, Maslow writes, neither are the humanistic scholars and the artists of any great help these days, because as a society we've become valueless, to use Maslow's term. He says, most humanistic scholars and most artists have shared in the general collapse of all traditional values. Many of them are, and I quote, disheartened or pessimistic or despairing, and a fair proportion are nihilistic or cynical, in a sense of believing that no good life is possible, and that the so-called higher values are all a fake and a swindle. I recently wrote an article titled Beyond Modern Nihilism, the Revival of Symbolism and Beauty in Art. And in that essay, what I was trying to get across was this idea that art should not only inspire the viewer, but should initiate the viewer by taking them beyond the art itself and helping them transcend this particular moment and experience the infinite in some small way. If you're not already receiving my emails, go over to my Substack and put your email in. Every week I send my top favorite quotes from the books that I'm studying into your inbox, and you can quickly skim it, read it. And once a month I write long form essays like the one on art. Now back to this. Maslow says it's plausible that, and I quote, all mystical or peak experiences are the same in their essence and have always been the same. All religions are the same in their essence and always have been the same. This is part of the excerpt that I read. What he's getting at is there's just too many similarities between what's happening in his clinical studies and in the works that he's reading from history's mystics. and I quote, "The commonality is peak experience. When you peel away the localism, all the accidents of particular languages, of particular philosophy, all the ethnocentric phrasings, all those elements which are not now common, we may call transcendent experience." In 2024, if you wanted to read works by Sufis, the Islamic mystics, then you can easily go find it through your public library, on Amazon, or on the internet. If you wanted to read Hindu mystics, you could do that easily. But back in the 60s, they were just getting exposed to Advaita Vedanta Hinduism that was coming in. There was a growing trend of cross-religious ecumenical dialogue. So what Maslow is saying here in his book, Religion, Values, and Peak Experiences, would have been accepted by certain scholars and spiritual leaders at that time when they were having ecumenical dialogues. Now, what is interesting is that Maslow says that if you're too rational, meaning you are too narrow-minded and you're too materialistic and too mechanistic, you will likely never have a peak experience. He writes, "Any person whose character, structure, or way of life forces him to try to be extremely or completely rational, or materialistic or mechanistic, tends to become a non-peaker." And the reason for that is this person is afraid of losing himself in peak experience because he wants control, he wants stability, and he will fight this peak experience no matter what. And as a result of that, he won't experience it. And the same goes for the compulsive, obsessive person. Has spent their whole life controlling their emotions, that the possibility of having an emotion overwhelming this is impossible. This makes me think of the samurais, and within the Bushido, there's this idea that you should always have composure. You should never let your emotions show on your face, no matter what happens, even when you're getting killed by your enemy, or even if you have to commit seppuku. You should never lose your composure. And so then you think, okay, perhaps the samurais are out of this, are part of these non-peaking experiencers. But if you remember the episode we did with Miyamoto Musashi, which is episode 12, you'll remember that Miyamoto Musashi, right at the end of the Book of Five Rings, he talks about his mystical experience that he has in the cave. And Miyamoto Musashi is obviously a Ronin, who Ronins are samurais without a lord, so he obviously used to be a samurai. But in this situation, we obviously don't know whether he lost his composure when he has this mystical experience. At least the way I read that last section, it seems to be a mystical experience. So it doesn't seem to be that if you are somebody with composure, somebody who doesn't want to lose his composure, it doesn't prevent you from having a peak experience. Rather, what seems to be the problem that Maslow is getting at is this somebody who is compulsive, obsessive person, that they are afraid that if they have a peak experience, they will quote unquote lose control, and they didn't want to lose control. And as a result, there's this innate clinging to the self, to the ego. He's also got this great sentence against philosophers, and he criticizes them for not seeking truth. He writes, "They sharpen tools rather than discover truth." And the type of philosophers that Maslow is criticizing with this statement are what's known as analytic philosophy, or analytic philosophers, more properly said. And these are people who took Hume's fork and said, okay, philosophy doesn't really have anything to say, and so what we'll do instead is we'll focus on defining terms and working on language. That's what philosophy is about. And Maslow saw this as completely useless. He's like, look, you're just sharpening tools. You're not doing anything. You're not discovering truth. You're also not engaging in the life, in this particular life. And he contrasts them sharply with the existentialists, right? With the phenomenologists who are trying to engage with this world. At least they're trying to engage with this world. And these type of philosophers would be similar to someone who collects tons and tons of knives, but actually never has used a knife, and more embarrassingly, doesn't even know how to use a knife to begin with. But they can talk about the intricacies of this knife, the weight of this knife, but besides holding it and knowing what this knife is made out of, they actually don't know how to employ the knife at all. And in the same breath, Maslow goes on to criticize organized religious ceremonies, because he says that they're too limiting in that many people think the experience of the transcendent, the experience of the profound, the holy, they've limited only to like a single day. And the ceremonies involved tend to strip away the desire for the individual for peak experience. He says, religionizing only one part of life secularizes the rest of it. Then he says, the degree of religious organization may correlate negatively with the frequency of religious experiences. What he's saying here is, the more religious you are, or at least the more religious you think you are, the less likely that you're going to have any sort of religious, spiritual experience. And that's because you are too rigid. You are like that obsessive, compulsive person who's too egotistical and cannot let go of this framework that they've created. Whether that framework is real or true, they've just created and they don't want to let go of it, or they don't know how to let go of it. But I don't think he's saying you should be less religious. What he's saying is, if you're religious, understand that having peak experiences will shatter the concepts that you think you understand, right? If you think you understand the transcendental nature of, say, quote unquote, God or of love, when you actually have a peak experience, or when you have a mystical experience, you will not only go beyond that, but you will actually understand it experientially, and that is a different type of knowledge. And like I said, for Maslow, you need these peak experiences if you really want to be a better human being. In a footnote, he comments that people who are self-actualized, remember the famous Maslow's pyramid, he says are much better humans. They tend to be more heroic. They tend to be more divine, awe-inspiring, lovable, great, godlike in the way they treat other people, meaning they treat them with much deeper sense of love. He goes on to state that we don't need to attribute some religious or spiritual connotations to this because it's something natural. Right? These people with saintly or heroic characteristics aren't different than you and I. If they can do it, it means that you can do it. The difference is that you and I have been sold short into thinking that we need some sort of spiritual being, some sort of supernatural thing to help us attain to these characteristics, according to Maslow. Now, this is a point of disagreement for me because it sounds good to say that we've been sold short a story about this idea that we need some supernatural intervention to be heroic, to be inspiring, to be lovable, so on and so forth. But in reality, this is not true at all, right? It isn't true that human beings have been sold short on the potentiality of our humanity. You can read about being heroic, for example, in Balthazar Gracian's book. And we looked at Balthazar Gracian's work in episode 27 on how to be a hero. And even though Gracian was a Jesuit priest, his writings never, or at least very little, employed God and the supernatural and the divine. He was on a mission to inspire his reader to be heroic because he believed that you could be heroic. So I disagree with Maslow here, but it doesn't mean that there aren't people who think that you need some sort of spiritual, supernatural thing to inspire you to do something heroic. Now, related to this is this point he makes early on in the book, talking about how most psychotherapists would agree that a large portion of affluent nations are caught up in a situation of valuelessness. And this results in our inability to have peak experiences. So he writes, a large proportion of the population of affluent nations, not only America, are caught in this situation of valuelessness, although most of these therapists are still speaking superficially and symptomatically of character neurosis, immaturity, juvenile delinquency, overindulgences, etc. Maslow here is talking about, and he's trying to get to the point that our sense of meaninglessness in our society, and this is in the 60s, all these decades have passed and we're still in the same society. We're suffering with this sense of meaninglessness. And it's going to get worse and worse as more and more are feeling lonely and less connected to their community. What Maslow's getting at is this meaninglessness, existential boredom, spiritual starvation, this rootlessness that we are suffering from makes it that we are unable to appreciate and experience beautiful things. also because our artists and our humanists aren't inspiring it in us. They're actually taking on this valuelessness and creating ugly art. They're creating art that simply shocks and disgusts its viewers instead of inspiring them to be better humans. And beautiful things are what give us meaning, but we don't have beauty in this world, not in our art certainly. And that is part of the reason why I'm painting, and that's part of the reason why I'm creating art. Definitely check out the article that I wrote. It'll be in the description. Now, Maslow says, we don't know what to do with the experiential, the subjective, the phenomenological that the existentialists stress so much. And that is this idea of self engaging in this world, right? I and thou. What do we do with this? How do we experience meaningfulness if we don't even know where to begin? And this, unfortunately, causes us, he writes, to have, quote, nothing to admire, to sacrifice themselves for, to surrender to die for. This gap calls for filling. If there's nothing beautiful in the world, if there's nothing meaningful in the world, if your relationships aren't meaningful, if the art that you're experiencing doesn't inspire anything in you, and they're ugly, and the art is about the nihilistic philosophy of the artist, then what is there to admire? If we don't have a sense of duty to our fellow man, to protect him, to love our neighbor as ourselves, then what is there to sacrifice ourselves for? What is there to die for? Maslow goes on to say, this results in, and I quote, a rather bleak, boring, unexciting, unemotional, cool philosophy of life, which fails to do what the traditional religions have tried to do when they were at their best, to inspire, to awe, to comfort, to fulfill, to guide in the value choices, and to discriminate between higher and lower, better and worse, not to mention to produce Dionysic experiences, wildness, rejoicing, impulsiveness. And when he's talking about cool, he doesn't mean what we mean by cool in our modern day and age. He's talking about here unemotional, right? Something that is completely detached from life. One point he brings up about this lack of valuelessness in our society are the Nazi scientists who did their work, who did their experiments, who did their research simply by saying, oh, none of these things actually matter. We don't actually have any ethical values that bind us. We have no moral values that pull us back. There's no real religion that secures us and grounds us. We're simply looking at this as a blank slate. We can do, and as a result, they could do whatever they wanted, right? Because they were just simply acting out of their own desires, out of whatever instruction was given by the authorities. The thing that they were most faithful to was the authority. What he's trying to get across here is warning us, the reader, that we do not want to repeat what has happened in the past with the Nazi scientists. We don't want to be like them. And if we don't want to be like them, we actually need, peak experience. We need values. We need a form of religion. That's what he's getting at. And this is because Maslow sees religion and science as not opposed to each other. He writes, the big lesson that must be learned here, not only by the non-theist and liberal religionists, but also by the supernaturalist and by the scientists and the humanists, is that mystery, ambiguity, illogic, contradiction, mystic and transcendent experiences may now be considered to lie well within the realm of nature. This mystical experience for Maslow is something that can be studied. And that's why he says it's in the realm of nature. And if it's in the realm of nature, then science and religion aren't really opposed to each other. Not that they're really opposed to each other. If you look at any of the great philosophers, theologians from across religious traditions, you will find that there is no incompatibility between religion and science. The only time this sense of incompatibility arises are within the fundamentalists of the religious sectors and the fundamentalist scientists as well. Which means that if peak experience is one of the most important things, right, and if it falls under the realm of nature, he writes, another consequence of this new insight into the highest human end goals and end values is that it holds for every living human being. Furthermore, it holds from the moment of birth until the moment of death, even from before birth and after death, in some very real sense. And therefore, if education in a democracy is necessarily seen as helping every single person, not only an elite towards its fullest humanness, then in principle, education is properly a universal, ubiquitous, and lifelong proposition. It implies education for all the human capacities, not only the cognitive ones. It implies education for the feeble-minded people as well as intelligent ones. It implies education for adults as well as children, and implies that education is certainly not confined to the classroom. He stresses the importance of education. He goes on a whole section about it, because he thinks the only way to bridge this illusory opposition between religion and science can only be done through proper education. And we need this proper education to move forward within our study of peak experiences. And this in turn, this proper education will then allow us to look at what is, according to him, the highest value. He writes, the final and unavoidable conclusion is that education must be concerned with its final value, and this in turn is just about the same as speaking of what have been called spiritual values or higher values. So through his study, Maslow is coming back to what philosophy, theology, and religion were originally always about, and philosophy specifically. It was about understanding what is the good life, what is a good man, what does it mean to raise my children. So he actually goes on to write, these are the principles of choice which help us to answer the age-old spiritual questions. What is the good life? What is the good man, the good woman? What is the good society? And what is my relation to it? What are my obligations to the society? What is best for my children? What is justice, truth, virtue? What is my relation to nature, to death, to aging, to pain, to illness? How can I live a zestful, enjoyable, meaningful life? What is my responsibility to my brothers? Who are my brothers? What shall I be loyal to? What shall I be ready to die for? These are questions that have historically been looked at by philosophers and theologians. If we look at Plato's Republic, he's addressing some of this. If you look at the Bhagavad Gita, it's addressing some of this. If you look at the Bible, it's addressing some of this. If you look at the Quran, it's addressing some of this. Humanity across time, culture, have always tried to answer these questions. And wherever it is, people have given a response to it. And it was only very recent in our human history that we thought, yeah, these are totally useless questions. And the answers are even less meaningful because of the logical positivist. And Maslow is trying to tear himself away from it to show that actually, when it comes down to what it means to have a meaningful life, the most important questions to ask ourselves are these questions that he's asking. It is only by answering these questions properly and by studying people who've answered these questions or who've at least attempted to address these will we actually find meaning and enjoyable life. So then he writes, education must be seen as at least partially an effort to produce the good human being, to foster the good life, the good society. Renouncing this is like renouncing the reality and the desirability of morals and ethics. Furthermore, an education which leaves untouched the entire region of transcendental thought is an education which has nothing important to say about the meaning of human life. And we're talking about Abraham Maslow, who considered himself at best an agnostic, but I think it's more accurate to frame him as an atheist. He's saying that if we want to actually understand human life, and if we want to have anything important to say about the meaning of our lives, our education must touch this idea of the transcendental, this peak experience that he's studying. Because it is in these peak experience moments that the human being becomes alive, fully alive, such that this human being is able to have a sense of deep connection with the world, with the cosmos, have this sense of experience the whole universe as an integrated, unified whole. They also have the sense of complete and full awareness of the present moment. And somehow it is in these moments, in these experiences, that the human being finds meaning. In the appendix of this book, he mentions 24 religious aspects of peak experiences, and I'm going to read through some of them. First one, for instance, it is quite characteristic in peak experiences that the whole universe is perceived as an integrated and unified whole. This is not as simple as happening as one might imagine from the bare words themselves. To have a clear perception rather than a purely abstract and verbal philosophical acceptance that the universe is all of a piece and that one has his place in it, one is a part of it, one belongs in it, can be so profound and shaking an experience that it can change the person's character and his Weltanschauung forever after. In my own experience, I have two subjects who, because of such an experience, were totally, immediately, and permanently cured of, in one case, chronic anxiety and neurosis, and in the other case, a strong obsessional thought of suicide. This, of course, is a basic meaning of religious faith for many people. People who might otherwise lose their faith will hang on to it because it gives a meaningfulness to the universe, a unity, a single philosophical explanation which makes it all hang together. I'll skip ahead and read number 2. In the cognition that comes in peak experiences, characteristically the precept is exclusively and fully attended to. That is, there is tremendous concentration of a kind which does not normally occur. There is the truest and most total kind of visual perceiving and listening or feeling. Part of what this involves is a peculiar change which can best be described as non-evaluating, non-comparing, and non-judging cognition. That is to say, figure and ground are less sharply differentiated. Important and unimportant are also less sharply differentiated. I.e., there is a tendency for things to become equally important rather than be ranged in a hierarchical from very important to quite unimportant. Number 3, the cognition of being or B-Cognition that occurs in peak experience tends to perceive external objects, the world and individual people as more detached from human concerns. In peak experiences, we become more detached, more objective, and more able to perceive the world as if it were independent not only of the perceiver but even of human beings in general. He can more easily refrain from projecting human purposes onto it. In a word, he can see it in his own being as an end in itself rather than as something to be used or something to be afraid of or something to wish for or to be reached to in some other personal, human, and self-centered way. Number 7, in peak experience, there is a very characteristic disorientation in time and space, or even the lack of consciousness of time and space. Phrased positively, this is like experiencing universality and eternity. Certainly, we can have here, in a very operational sense, a real and scientific meaning of under the aspect of eternity. This kind of timelessness and spacelessness contrasts very sharply with normal experiences. The person in the peak experience may feel a day passing as if it were minutes, or also a minute so intensely lived that it might feel like a day or a year or an eternity even. He may also lose his consciousness of being located in a particular place. Number 8, the world seen in the peak experience is seen only as beautiful, good, desirable, worthwhile, etc., and is never experienced as evil or undesirable. The world is accepted. People will say that then they understand it. Most important of all, for comparison with religion, thinking is something that somehow they become reconciled to evil. Evil itself is accepted and understood and seen in its proper place in the whole as belonging there, as unavoidable, as necessary, and therefore as proper. Of course, the way in which I and Lasiki also gathered peak experience was by asking the reports of ecstasies and raptures of the most blissful and perfect moments of life. Number 12. In peak experience, such emotions as wonder, awe, reverence, humility, surrender, even worship before the greatness of the experience are often reported. This may go so far as to involve thoughts of death in a particular way. Peak experiences can be so wonderful that they can parallel the experience of dying. That is of an eager and happy dying. It is a kind of reconciliation and acceptance of death. Scientists have never considered as a scientific problem the question of the good death. But here, in these experiences, we discover a parallel to what has been considered to be the religious attitude towards death, i.e., humility or dignity before it, willingness to accept it, possibly even a happiness to it. 2 more I'll read. Number 20. The peak experiencer becomes more loving and more accepting, and so he becomes more spontaneous and honest and innocent. And lastly, number 25, what has been called the unitive consciousness is often given to peak experiences, i.e. a sense of the sacred glimpsed in and through the particular instance of the momentary, the secular, the worldly. What happens in peak experience is a shift in conscious awareness state. And it is through these peak experiences that you attain new knowledge. And I quote, "For one, love, fascination, absorption can frequently mean looking intensely with care. For another, fascination can mean great intensity, narrowing and focusing of attention, and resistance to distraction of any kind, of boredom or even fatigue. Cosmic consciousness," a term he borrows from Buck, "involves an attention widening, so that the whole cosmos is perceived as a unity and one's place in the world is simultaneously perceived." This is the type of new knowledge he's talking about, right? This knowledge can be a change in attitude, in values, in seeing things from a new perspective. So the challenge for this week is to embrace and cultivate peak experiences, to incorporate some form of value and spiritual practice in your daily life, and also to encourage you towards self-actualization, because for Maslow, that is, people who are self-actualized are the ones who are most attuned to having peak experiences. So just going back to when I say embrace, cultivate peak experiences, these are doing activities that encourage it, right? That, like meditation, if you are creative, do something creative. If you're more nature oriented, go out on walks. If you're more around quality of time spent with loved ones, do those things, right? These moments of profound meaning can enhance your ability to experience peak. The second one that I mentioned is incorporating spiritual practices, or better yet, it's this idea of incorporating spiritual education and values into your daily life. And this is just around reading, having discussions around what is the good life? What does it mean to be moral? What does it mean to raise children if you have children? What does it mean to love somebody if you love somebody? Having this sort of conversation and spending time studying these will allow you to have a much more meaningful and purposeful life. And this is something that Maslow discovered in his own studies, in his own practices, in his research. And with that, I'll wrap. By the way, I launched a Patreon page where you can support my work through paid subscription. I also launched a subscription on my Substack. Your support makes it possible for me to do this work. I easily spend over 30 hours making each episode, and I love doing it. And thank you to all those who are already subscribed. I want you to think of a subscription as a vote towards doing this work and bringing wisdom to the world. And I understand that not everyone will want to support becoming Antifragile in this way, and that's totally okay. I appreciate your presence regardless. If you're not ready to become a patron or become a paid member on my Substack, but enjoy my work, share it with others, share it with your friends, your family, help spread the wisdom in the world. For those seeking more access, upgrading to a paid member is the best way to connect with me and my work. And that's it. Thank you for listening. Till next week, peace.